right, well, let's pray. Gracious God, now as we look at the scriptures and the stories of women whose lives and actions made it to the Bible, Lord, help us to learn new things. And whatever there is good and helpful and true, may it come to land in our hearts and inspire us. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so the first group of women that are in that notes from the second time we were together, most of them, they came from the book of Genesis, okay? So what I've done now is I've jumped out of Genesis and I'm heading on, and I've covered what I think are basically the highlights in the rest of the Hebrew Bible, okay? There's lots and lots of women named there, but these are the most famous ones anyway, that's what the scholars thought. So the first one is, we jump to the book of Joshua. Okay, we're jumping out of the Torah, the books of Moses, and into the book of Joshua. Anybody quickly remember what the book of Joshua is about? In a nutshell, remember Moses gets the Israelites to the promised land, or right at the edge of the promised land, and God says, you can't go in, but Joshua, your helper, he's going to take over. He now is the new Moses. He's going to lead the Israelites into the land. And once they get into the land, what do they start doing? Killing all manner of people. They're conquering the promised land. And so the book of Joshua is a very bloody book. It really is. But it is the story of how these Israelites came in and fought with different tribes in different areas. But at the beginning of that story, Joshua sends in a couple of spies, right? A couple of spies in the promised land. And what were they supposed to do? Check it out, right? Go in, see what it's all about. And so these spies go and they find what? Grapes that are huge and all manner of living things and animals. And they go and they report back that it's just a great thing. It's a great thing, right? So while they were there, they go near this village and they encounter a woman named Rahab. What was Rahab's profession? She was a prostitute. Which makes you wonder, were those spies? It sounds like they kind of stopped at the brothel, right? To see Rahab. But it turns out that Rahab saved their lives. Rahab the prostitute saved these two spies' lives. They get there. The word around this village was that there's two foreigners in the village. They send soldiers to the brothel, to Rahab's house, to find them. And Rahab, what does she do? She hid those Joshua's two spies in the roof, like the thatched roof. She hid them under there, and then she took a huge risk, and she said, they're not here. They're not here. They left. And I don't know where they went. So the soldiers leave, and they go running to try to find them. In the meantime, the agents, their spies' lives are saved, and they made it out. So this foreign woman, this Canaanite woman, saves these Israelites' lives. And then there's a funny little addition to this story. Anybody know the rest of the story about the red cord that would hang out of the window? These spies say to her, well, we're going to come back and we're going to take this place over, but you've been kind to us, so that we won't come in and destroy you and your house. You better leave a red cord hanging out of the window where they jumped out. Leave a red cord there, and that way we will know. I will tell everybody, whatever you do, do not come and kill this woman and anybody in her house. And I've always wondered, and maybe someone knows, is that where the whole red thing, the red letter A and all that stuff comes by the red? I've always wondered, maybe is that the connection? I wonder. It comes right out of the Bible. But it had to be a red cord. Isn't that weird? I thought so. Okay, so that's Rahab, and Rahab was a Zona. A Zona was an a not so nice way of saying a woman without a husband because she was a prostitute. Because remember the rules. You just had to get married. You got married as a young girl. Okay. That's in Joshua, the 2nd chapter. Now we're going to jump up to Judges, and we're going to get into some of the fearsome women. The next woman I want to talk about is Deborah. Her story is in Judges 4. Deborah was considered a prophetess. Okay, she received. She had this like a psychic ability to receive messages from God. She knew things, and people would come to her and ask for her for wisdom and guidance. Okay, she was also one of the leaders in her tribe, which is weird given what the rules were about women. You know, women were to be under a man's authority, and you take care of the house. But she must have been a fearsome woman. Okay. And so she directed this man named Barak, B-A-R-A-K, said who came to her asking for her guidance and wisdom about a battle. And so prophetess Deborah says, well, go into the battle against this other dude named Sisera, a Canaanite warrior. Sisera narrowly escapes death in a battle with Barak, and he fled away. He hides, and this is one of the gruesome stories. He goes and he finds a tent, right? This guy's running for his life. And he finds this tent, and the tent belongs to a woman named Jael. Jael. And what happens next? Does anybody remember this story? No, kind of worse. Okay. So stake right through his head. So she goes into the tent, and she's kind to him and gives him something to eat. Says, now why don't you just take a little nap, and you just rest. And while he's taking a nap with his head down on the ground, she takes a tent peg and drives it through his head. And I happen to have a picture of it. This does not come from a children's Bible. I've always wondered if there was a picture of this. So here she is. There's fearsome Jael. See your tent? So that's the story of Deborah the judge, who tells this guy to go into battle. The guy gets loose. He runs for his life. He runs into somebody's tent, and there meets the woman who would take his life, named Jael. I call her Jael the executioner. She was fearsome. All right, now next is, this next woman does not have, I don't believe, I looked, I couldn't find a name. But anybody remember the name Jephthah? Jephthah in the Bible? Jephthah. Isn't Wade Chapel named after Jephthah Wade? Yeah, so I don't think anybody's named Jephthah anymore. But anyway, Jephthah. Jephthah was the son of a prostitute, but he became a mighty warrior and a judge. He is one of these judges. Most of the judges were men, but there were a couple of women. So he became a mighty warrior and a judge, which means he was like a leader of a tribe, because people stayed together in small tribes. And remember the old Ammonites? So he went into battle against these Ammonites. And when he did it, in order to assure his success, he made God a promise that he would later deeply regret. What did he promise God as he went into the battle? If you'll give me success, if you'll help me to destroy these Ammonites, I promise you I'm going to do this. He said, and this is some of the cruelties of the Old Testament. He promised God that he would sacrifice the first person that he saw coming out the front door of his house when he returned home. Now do you remember the story? Who was the first person that came out of his house? His daughter. His daughter came out of the house. And, most of us would think, well, I don't think God would mind if you just break that promise. But this is sort of the magic of the day. You make God a promise and you have to fulfill it. And so he told his daughter about the promise and that he had to kill her and then burn her as a sacrifice to God. And you know what she said? Okay, you can do that, but first, she asked her dad to do something. She says, but first, let me take my girls, my friends, and go into the mountains, and there I will lament my virginity. The fact that she was a young girl, right? To go into the hills and to spend 2 whole months with her dearest friends, sort of enjoying the last 2 months of her life and, quote, lamenting my virginity. I never got married. And she does. And she comes back, and he did it.
Wow. I don't understand why, if asking God is pretty God say, oh, no, don't do this, no.
Well, that's a great question, Larry, and that's what everybody's thinking. Why, But that's what I would call very primitive religion. The whole idea of doing things to sort of push God, making promises, ask, if you do this, I'll do that, or that kind of thing, which is really very primitive, almost like magic religion. And it's all over the Old Testament. It is, let's be honest. Okay? But I guess that, when that promise is made, you can't go back on it. Remember the story of Isaac and the 2 sons, and how Jacob deceived Esau, and even though Isaac came to realize that the wool had been pulled over his eyes, he's like, the deed is done. I've already done it. It can't be undone. You'll become the next heir of the family. Now in my mind, I was thinking, well, I just undo it. Well, there was no undoing it. Promises, these covenants were binding. And so this is an example of it. Yeah.
So the word was, instead of a written contract, it was their word.
Well, especially if you make a promise like that to God. Now, I read this story. What do you think a lesson is when you read this story? Be very careful about the promises you make to anybody, whether it's God or a friend or whatever. Be very, very careful about that. But this guy, there was no breaking the promise. He promised Yahweh the God. And my guess is he feared that if he broke that promise, something really bad would happen to him. So he went through with it.
Kind of adds to the narrative, though, in the end, as to why Jesus comes is, okay, people, you've been screwing this up enough.
Yeah.
Now God has to come down in human form. It's like, here's what you need to be doing instead.
Well, one of the reasons you heard that in the sermon today, one of the reasons that Jesus was rejected is because he rejected a lot of this primitive religion, this magical primitive religion stuff, and said, you don't need to fuss with all your conjurations and things like that. That's really not important. God is bigger than you imagine. Joe.
This may not be fair to ask this of you right now.
I'll tell you if it is.
I'm just sitting here thinking of today and the last several days, and I understand all this horrible violence of humans against humans, and how it's kind of a history that these people in Jerusalem and right now, it's in their psyche, it's in their blood or something. It's just heartless and hopeless.
Yeah.
And come on.
Yeah. I chalk it up to freedom. One of God's greatest and most terrible gifts is freedom. The freedom to choose what we're going to do. And sometimes in our freedom we make horrendous choices and do terrible things.
These are, maybe they're not intelligent.
No, they are.
This is just in their psyche. I mean, it's in their blood to kill each other.
Well, it goes back, as you know, in ancient history.
It goes back.
Way back.
So what hope is there?
My hope is that leaders with sound and expansive minds will wake up and say, both of you are a part of this land. Both of you need your own nations. I think that's the only solution, is a two-state solution. That's my perspective. There hasn't been peace since 1948, and we're seeing terrible things, you know. Yeah, it's too gruesome to even, I can't even watch it. It's just too gruesome to think about what's happened. But that's what I said, that's that God's greatest gift and God's most terrible gift to us is freedom. Freedom to do the right things, the compassionate things, and freedom to make terrible, 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 horrible, awful choices. And I think it must make God weep. Like, was this really a good idea? I don't know that was much of an answer, Joe. Okay, all right.
Thank you.
All right, this next woman, I know you know this story. Delilah, Samson and Delilah. You know that story? From the book of Judges. We're still in the book of Judges. Samson, let's talk about him first. Who was Samson? Samson was a Nazarite, which was a male, had to be a male, who was consecrated to God as a baby. And there's all kinds of promises that the parents make. There are people who think John the Baptist was a Nazarite. Okay? Or some think Jesus was a Nazarite. But there's all kinds of promises. And one of the promises is that in order to show that they're a Nazarite, you don't cut their hair. Okay? The men never cut their hair. So the story is that Samson was a Nazarite. He was especially dedicated to God. But he violated, the commentators I read said he violated all kinds of those Nazarite vows. He was not a very good Nazarite or Nazarene, including the one about haircuts. And he went to Gaza, which was the area of the Philistines where the Gaza Strip is. And he went to visit a brothel, as men were wont to do in those days. And there he met a Philistine woman named Delilah, right? So he went to visit this brothel and meets Delilah. And Delilah says, and he was very strong. On his way out of the town, I think the story is he tore the gates off the front walls of the city. He was a big man and he was very strong. He tore and everybody wanted to know, what is the secret? How did this guy get so strong? And so they asked Delilah to bring him back to the brothel and find out how this Nazarene is so strong. And he finally told her where his strength was. The strength was in his long hair. That's the story, okay? And so what does she do? When he is asleep, she doesn't drive a peg through his brain. She takes scissors and she cuts his hair. And when he comes to, he isn't strong anymore, and soldiers rush in and they bind him and they turn him into a slave, right? And he's turning grain, pushing a big millstone and turning grain. But while he's doing that, what's happening? His hair is growing back. And then all these awful Philistines, they go into their little temple house and they said, we're going to worship Dagon, our God, and we're going to bring Samson in, and we're just going to harass him with this. And so while they're dancing into their idol Dagon, what does Samson do? He asks God to help him, to give him strength, and he stands between two of the big pillars holding the roof up, and he pushes them enough that the ceiling, the roof collapses, kills him and kills everybody inside the temple and destroys those Philistines. That's the story of Samson and Delilah. I think there's an opera, a bunch of, yeah, there's a lot. That's a well-known Bible story, but that's the story of Samson and Delilah. Samson, who, for all practical purposes, he took his own life, right? He knew if he did this, he was killing himself and he was killing his people. He is praised and honored among his people for what he did. Praised and honored. Okay, now the next is two women, and I know you're going to know these names. Ruth and Naomi. Ruth and Naomi. Anybody know this story?
Ruth goes with the Jewish people,
Yeah. Yeah. Ruth was not a Jew.
but she goes with them because
Yes.
she's married to a Jew.
Right.
Naomi stays with her people.
Yeah. Ruth was a Moabite, not a Jew. But she marries a Jew, an Israelite, because she was very beautiful. And at some point, her husband, the Jewish guy, dies, and so does her father-in-law. They die. And so there's two women. Remember, one of the worst things in the world was to be a woman without a man. So both of these men died in this household, the father and the son. Okay? But Ruth, who was not an Israelite, she's so kind and compassionate and caring for her mother-in-law, Naomi, that she loved. She promises to stay with Naomi. We are going to stick together. I will go where you go. I will be with your people. And they travel to Bethlehem. Remember, they go to Bethlehem. And there, young Ruth meets a guy named Boaz. Remember? Boaz. And takes her in and protects her. And did you know this? Ruth is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. Ruth is in there. She's so beloved. So there's the example of a very kind, good-hearted woman who was not an Israelite. She was considered a foreigner and a pagan. I think she probably became a God-fearer. How much she cared for her mother-in-law, her Jewish mother-in-law, and when both of their men died, she stuck with her, took her with her, and then she married another Israelite, Boaz, who then took care of both of them. It's really a lovely story. It's a story that's often read at weddings. You know, I will be with your God, I will be with your people, that sort of thing. Okay. Next woman, you'll know this name. Bathsheba. Bathsheba. This is out of the book of 2 Kings, or 2 Samuel. Bathsheba is, she was a very good-looking woman, right? But she was also a married woman, remember? She was married to Uriah the Hittite. And Uriah the Hittite was a very well-respected soldier in King David's army. Remember the story now?
Yes.
What happened? One day, King David is looking out his window, and he sees Bathsheba where? Remember the story?
On the road.
She's having a rooftop bath, right? And David is looking out and sees this woman, and he's like, wow, what a babe. I want her.
But she was married.
She was married. And he sent soldiers, and the soldiers got Bathsheba, took her back to, I guess, his palace, his home, and they ended up having a baby, right? She got pregnant. And then this is the really awful part. So she's pregnant, her stomach is starting to get bigger, and what does David do? Because he's going to be found out.
He sent Uriah to be killed.
Yeah. He finagles this plan so that Uriah is put out in front of the other armies. He's like a sitting duck to be killed. So David pretty much arranges for his murder, to kill him, get him off the scene, and then he says, "Oh, I'll marry my dear soldier's wife, this poor widow woman." And that's what he does. In the meantime, and the public is going, "Okay, that's really nice. Isn't he a good guy?" In the meantime, somehow Nathan the prophet, remember Nathan is the one that anointed the king. Somehow Nathan knows what really happened. He knows. Maybe the story's floating around town. He knows. And Nathan confronts David. Nathan the prophet confronts the king and says what? He tells him the story about a guy who took somebody else's stuff that didn't belong to him, and he goes, "You are that man. You did it. You took that man's wife." And David confesses. There's this big scene where he cries and confesses. And Nathan says, well, God will forgive you, but the baby will die. The baby dies, right? In the meantime, Bathsheba and David are married. They then have a son. And what was the son's name? Anybody remember? Solomon. Solomon. Who became the third king of Israel, remember? It was Samuel, David, and Solomon. So he has another baby with Bathsheba named Solomon. And later in life, as David is nearing his death, now David had other wives too. Don't think he did. He didn't. He had other wives and other children. But guess what? It was Nathan the prophet that convinced David to name Solomon as his successor. And so the dynasty continued. But that was Bathsheba and the horrible, terrible sin that David committed by having her husband killed and taking her as his wife. I think it's made for a lot of novels, the same story, right? Okay, this next story is really interesting. This is in the book of 1 Samuel. These are the history books of Israel. And there was a medium. You know what a medium is? She's also called a witch. I don't think technically speaking that's what she was. She was a medium. A medium is a person who is said to be able to channel the spirits of the dead, to communicate with the dead and give messages to the living. So Samuel, who was the first king, remember Samuel was the first king, he runs all of the mediums out of the area. He gets rid of them. But his life starts to go down the tubes because everybody's turning to little David to become the next king. And Samuel's lost. And he goes, I just need to hear something. I need to hear something. And so he goes to this medium in Endor, the medium of Endor. And he says, I want you to bring up the spirit of the prophet Samuel. And he said, and I want to find out what's going to happen. By the way, he disguised himself. And so this medium did it. And Samuel, I'm talking about Saul, and Samuel, his spirit is conjured up through this woman. And do you know what he said? First of all, he was angry. He goes, why are you bothering me? And what did the spirit say to Saul? The spirit of the prophet Samuel say to King Saul? He said, you and your sons will die in battle tomorrow. And they did. And that's that terrible story about Absalom dying in battle. Because David and Absalom were friends, even though Absalom's father, Saul, hated him. And they do. And the next day they go into battle. Saul and Absalom and his other brothers are all killed in battle. So that's the medium of Endor. She doesn't have a name. Anybody heard that story? The medium of Endor. Okay. This next name I also think you'll know for sure. Queen Jezebel. Wasn't there a Betty Davis movie named Jezebel? Okay. Jezebel. Who was she? This is in the book of 1 Kings. Again, this is the chronology of the Israelites. She was the wife of King Ahab, who was an Israelite king of the northern kingdom. So this is after the three kings, the United Kingdom, and then they split, remember? And there was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. So Ahab was one of the many kings of the northern kingdom, and he had this wife named Jezebel. Jezebel was a very, very evil woman. Very, very evil queen. And she convinced her husband, goes, why are you continuing to worship Yahweh? You know, the kingdom is going down the tubes. You need to worship another god. How about, let's say, Baal? Remember the deities of Baal and Ashereth? Why don't you turn to those gods and maybe this kingdom will be saved? And so he does that. She pulls him away from the worship of the one true God to the worship of these deities. And when the prophets in the northern kingdom started speaking out against her, she killed them. She'd kill the prophets. She also loved makeup and clothing and hair. She was sort of an over-the-top, outrageous dresser. And that's where the expression "she's a Jezebel" comes from. So, a woman who's like wears crazy makeup and crazy hair and clothes, a Jezebel, that dresses sort of like a harlot. She also had a landowner. She wanted a piece of property. She wanted a piece of property, and the landowner refused to sell to her, so she had him killed too. There's another horrible, evil thing she did. But eventually, old, evil Jezebel met her end. Do you remember how it happened? She was thrown, her servants, who hated her guts because she was so mean, they picked her up and threw her out of a window. And of course, she landed on the ground and died. And the dogs ate her. Isn't that a lovely story? Yeah. So she got her payback big time. That's Jezebel. The next story is a lovely story. Ever remember the woman, the Shunammite woman, and Elisha? Elisha the prophet and the Shunammite woman. She doesn't have a name. The Shunammite. She was a wealthy woman, and she would take Elisha the prophet in and take care of him, give him food, give him a place to stay in the village. And to show his appreciation, he said to her, "Well, what can I do for you? What can I do for you?" And she goes, "Well, I don't have a son, and her husband was old, so I really need a son, because if this old guy dies, they're going to take my property, and guess what? I'll have nothing. So I need a son." And so Elisha, does some kind of ritual and says, "I'll be back in a year, and when I come back, you'll have a baby." And sure enough, he came back, and she had a son. And it all seemed well, except that little boy, died. And she calls for Elisha. And Elisha comes. And what does Elisha do with the dead little boy? He brings him back to life. The Bible says that he actually climbed on top of him, and it says mouth to mouth, and covered him with his body, like warmth, and breathed into him, like mouth to mouth resuscitation, and the boy revived. And this other little quirk to this story, you ever heard people say, "Did you sneeze 7 times? Have you heard that? You always sneeze 7 times. That comes from this story. The boy sneezed 7 times. After he opened his eyes, he sneezed 7 times and he lived. Aren't these fun? All right, now. Okay, the next one, and this is our last one. There's 2 more women, but they come together. I'm sure you remember the name Esther. Esther. The book of Esther in the Bible. And then also a woman named Vashti. So here's the story about Esther. Esther became she was a Jew, and she became the beautiful queen of a Persian, a non-Jewish king, whose name is hard to pronounce, Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus took a disliking to his wife, and her name was Vashti. Okay? So here's the example of a Persian king saying, I know I'm married and I've got this Vashti, but I really like this one over here because she is a real looker. She's really good. And also Vashti wasn't very nice. She was always ordering her husband around, which just wasn't the done thing back then. Okay? So the king's chief advisor was Haman. Remember that name, Haman? And he wanted the king, now these are Persians, he wanted the king to just go ahead and kill all the Israelites. Because he was offended by this other man named Mordecai. I won't go into all that. So these are Persians, and they're saying, go ahead and just kill them all. Get rid of these people. But Esther, who is married to this Persian king, she foils the plan, and she sweet talks her husband into what? not allowing her husband to kill the Jews. And they live. And that is where the festival of Purim, the Jewish festival of Purim, because Esther, having married into this non-Jewish kingdom, family, saved the Jews in that land from annihilation. So this is the power of a woman to convince her husband to do something. So that's Esther and that's Vashti. So I don't know what happened to Vashti. I don't know if they, I think Vashti was around, but she like took second place or something like that. So that's Esther and Vashti. So those are the 10 women. I think those are the 10 best known stories beyond the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible. There's lots of other women in there, but those are the stories we all remember and know about. So next week what I'm going to do, we'll have one more Sunday of this. I'm going to look at women in the New Testament. Okay, look at women in the New Testament. We'll pull out 6 or 7 and talk about them. Any questions or comments?
Hi, is there another handout? Because I don't think this is what you have discussed.
Those are for the last 2 times. This stuff will be next week.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay? All right, thanks for being here. Have yourselves a great Sunday afternoon.